Chapter 2: The Great Plateau. The light from the fire did not reach far, though it did not need to with the morning sun still hanging in the sky. The old man was sitting close to it, though the day was warm enough that it should have been uncomfortable. These things she noted, tried to draw some correlation between them, and came up a bit short. Strange that the bearded stranger should have a fire going this early in the day, and no real way to reconcile it. When she stepped near, he looked up, his expression surprised. "Ah! Well met, stranger." In the space between his breaths Zelda stopped, and she thought. She was nearly positive he had seen her as she looked down at the rest of the landscape. Why feign surprise? Or maybe he hadn't actually seen her, and that was why he hadn't waved. Could the light have played a trick on his eyes? No, the sun had been behind him. Could he have simply failed to see her due to poor vision? If so, why had he been looking right at her? "Good morning, sir," she said. "I saw you from atop the cliff, and hoped you might be able to help me. I'm confused, hungry, exhausted, alone, amnesiac. Lost." He nodded, his beard lending him an air of solemnity deeper than the casting of his face. "It is a terrible thing, to be lost. You are the intersection of perils more demanding or concrete, especially with the world as it is now." In his right hand he was holding a walking stick, from which hung a lantern. With this he motioned to the other side of the fire. "Here, sit with me and we will talk. You'll find a baked apple by the fire. Feel free to partake." Her eyes cut to where he indicated, and there she saw the apple, red and wrinkled and steaming, sitting a comfortable distance away from the fire's heat. "I would not want to impose on you," she said, a formality running counter to the demands of her hunger. His face was genuinely warm, and for some reason it made her relax. There was an earnestness in his expression, despite his strangeness. "Please. I can always gather more apples, and I have already had my fill. I will be much happier for the conversation than to have an extra apple I can't even eat." She sat on the grass, taking the apple in her hand. It was warm to the touch, and even unseasoned, the smell emanating from it was rich and deep and still tart. Wiping it on her shirt to remove ash or soil, she bit into it, and it tasted as it smelled, sweet, the sugar of the apple turning to a thin syrup, but still tart and fresh and aromatic. She wondered how long it had been since she had eaten, and if that was why she was enjoying it so much. The relief of the first bite so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. The apple was enormous, as big as both of her fists held together, and she knew she was going to eat every part of it but its stem. "You said you were lost," the old man suggested, his tone relaxed but curious as she ate. "I'm just an old hermit, but have made my place here for a long, long time. Where are you going?" The question was a fair one, but also potentially dangerous. She had no memory of who she was, or where, or how she came to be there. She did not think that she had enough information to construct a lie to hide the extent of her ignorance. That ignorance was vulnerability, but to let someone else know about it was a separate vulnerability all on its own, giving them power over her. Could she risk that? Could she mitigate it somehow? She swallowed carefully, decided that she could not hide everything and still gain useful knowledge, and said, "It's less that I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where I am." Now, surprise again, but not too sharp, as if her ignorance of place was not wholly unexpected. "I'll tell you, then. We are on the Great Plateau. Legend says that this is the birthplace of the Kingdom of Hyrule." "Hyrule," she said, because the name echoed inside of her mind, seeking a place that it did not have. "Yes. We're near the center of the kingdom, though this place is not as it once was." He gestured with his staff again, indicating down the path, to an enormous and dilapidated stone building that looked like a temple or cathedral. "Do you see that structure? Once, it was a site of holy ceremonies that were central to the culture of this land. Now it stands ravaged and forgotten." He sighed through his nose. "Like so much in this place." She had no answer, and he did not urge her for more, so she continued eating. Faster than she would have thought she finished the apple, core and all, and dropped the stem onto the grass. "Thank you for sharing with me," she said, rising to her feet, "and for your help." "Not at all. There is plenty to share here, if you know how to look for it. You'll find the plateau full of apples in need of only a little warmth." She nodded to him and stepped back onto the path. She could have asked for better directions, but now she had enough information to get by, at least for a while. He said he was a hermit, but even hermits usually lived near enough to civilization, and she was confident she would be able to find a town or settlement so long as she could reach a high enough vantage point. She was in no hurry, and for whatever reason, that thought was immensely satisfying. She had only walked a few steps when the old man said behind her, "Wait a moment." She turned, and he got up from his seat, walking over to the wall of the outcropping where she saw a torch was leaned. He picked it up, walked over to her, held it out. "Take this with you, sir. A torch is a useful thing to have. It can light your way in the dark, be used to perpetuate or create a fire, and in a pinch." Here his expression darkened, his bushy eyebrows knitted together as if he was struggling with something. "In a pinch it can be a weapon." He gestured with the torch. "Here, don't be shy. I have more I can use for myself." "Oh, well." She reached out, took it from his hand, found the indirect contact between them both reassuring and off-putting at once. "Thank you. I will try to make use of it." The operative word there being try, she was not sure if she could make a fire by herself. "One last thing, please, and then you can go on your way without having to listen to my prattle." He gestured with his staff again. "The path here is not entirely safe." Her surprise must have shown on her face, then, because he nodded at her. "I see you understand. There is one beast in particular that likes to lie in wait in the bushes, eyes on the path, and to attack travelers with the branch of a tree. You'll find an axe in a stump a little way down the path. Take it with you. Are you much of a warrior, miss?" She shook her head. No point in hiding that, not with how she could feel the color draining from her face, how aware she was of the relative weakness of her limbs. No, whatever she had been before, a warrior was not it. "Then use your awareness to your advantage. The beasts that occupy the plateau are dangerous and in some cases cunning, but they are not very observant. Aware, any of them is a match and more for the average well-armed traveler." And here his posture changed, in a way that was very difficult to identify but very easy to perceive, as he pulled back his shoulders and stood straighter and tilted his head back. "But the greatest element one can have in a conflict is surprise. If they do not know you are there, you can get past them. Do you understand?" She nodded. His posture relaxed, and his smile was genuine and warm and so weary that she almost wanted to embrace him. "Good. Be safe." He turned, walking back to his fire and resuming his seat. She stared at him for what felt an impolite length of time, but he never looked up. The idea of beasts attacking lone travelers banged around in her head, and the sharpness and enormity of her vulnerability fell on her so concretely that she could not believe she hadn't perceived it before. What was she doing out here, alone? Why had she been thrust into this situation, which she more and more suspected she was not equipped to deal with? The dizzying freedom she had felt before talking to the old man and even during the conversation had given way to something else, a cloudy anxiety that colored how she saw the world as she looked down the path. The shadows were deeper now, though the sun had grown no brighter, and the green of the trees that had symbolized life now held more dangers than she would have believed before. She considered staying with the old man, asking him to travel with her, to ask for directions, to give up on the idea of doing all of this, whatever this was, but she knew there was something, on her own. It would be simpler to have companionship, and safer. It might slow things down, but a golden voice called to her across the vastness of the dark, and she remembered how the woman had pleaded. She walked down the path. Her nerves were no more still, her confidence driven to no greater heights, but still she walked. In a little time she came to the promised tree stump, and the promised axe with its head buried there. With effort she wrenched it free, holding it, feeling its weight in her hands before putting it on her back. An axe was a good thing to have, she told herself, even if she wasn't sure she had the strength to use it as a weapon. You could use it to cut firewood, to sharpen sticks, probably even to start fires somehow, if you were creative. Yes, it was a good thing to have, even if not as a weapon. She put the axe on her back, adjusted the straps of her shoulder harness, and walked down the path. The sunlight filtered through the foliage in dappled patterns, making the air cooler than it had been on the path. When she focused on that, Zelda found that it was easier to keep down her sense of impending panic. The line of trees on the left side of the path had been what the beast the old man mentioned would be waiting. She was sure there was no cover on the other side. The trees weren't very deep, there, nestled between the path and a steep drop down the cliff, which meant that whatever the thing was it had to be in a narrow band if it wanted to keep a clear eye on the road. When she had come to the trees she'd immediately ducked into them, keeping low and quiet as she stalked through the grass between the ancient trunks. She wasn't sure how quiet she was actually being, but the grass and ground was soft and she was keeping a careful eye out so as not to step on any fallen sticks or dry leaves. The effort of being that quiet was draining, but it was better than the alternative. The weight of the axe against her back was more of a burden than a promise, and she was more sure than ever that she wouldn't be able to swing it in defense if it came to that. Fine. It didn't matter if she could stay out of the thing's sight and hearing. Assuming it can't smell you, or hasn't laid some sort of trap, or that it doesn't have senses that you don't even have a name for, according to stimuli that your brain wouldn't understand. Yes, assuming all of that, she crept. The birds were lively and full-throated and happy on the great plateau, and she had found their song to be very calming, relatively speaking, for the past few minutes. Now she was grateful to them for another reason. They provided another layer of sound over her own footsteps, partially masking any mistake she was making. She hoped that they would sing to each other all the louder for it. A twig snapped, and Zelda froze mid-step. She looked down, even though she had heard it come from her right, closer to the road. Nothing at her feet to make noise. She crouched slower, suddenly aware of herself, other lines of sight that might reveal her to something stalking her. She looked to her right, straining to see. There, in the tall grass, a flash of red and brown. She raised herself, just enough, trying to see more, ready to bolt if she had to. Her legs still felt weak, but if she was chased she would run like she'd never run in her life. Great triangular red ears, like the ears of a pig, sat on top of a broad red head. She was behind the thing, which even as she watched broke the twig it had been holding with another clean snap, so she could not see its face. What she did see were the corded muscles that ran along its spine and shoulders, the ease with which it lay in wait, the stick it held while waiting for prey to come by. The axe weighed her down, and the thought of trying to hold it made her nauseous. Staying low, staying quiet, never stepping too quickly, she hurried away. When she came to the end of the copse she stepped out, still crouched and quiet even though she was confident she was out of sight of the thing in the bushes. The sun had risen higher, now, and the day was getting warmer though it would never get beyond pleasantly cool. It's all right, she told herself, using her voice, the fact of making noise, to force herself into being convinced. I'm past it, now, and don't need to hide anymore. She straightened her posture, taking careful note of what she was carrying, the torch, the axe, a few apples she had picked up while escaping through the trees. I'm much more well-equipped than I was before I went in. True though that was, she wasn't confident she was any more prepared, especially because she did not know where she wanted to go next. Well, lacking any other direction, the old man did say that the temple used to be an important place. If I explore it, I might be able to find more resources, even directions. Or, at least I can find some shelter. Convinced of the rightness of this course of action, she turned down the path, and immediately saw a speck of red in the distance. From this distance she couldn't tell what it was, but it looked like another thing like that which had been in the brush. Without thinking she took the slate from her hip, held it up in front of her face by the handles, and pressed a button on the side of it. It hummed, then clicked, the front of it lighting up and displaying a zoomed-in perspective as if the slate were also a looking glass. She had been right, too, another one of those red creatures, though this one she could see much more clearly. Bipedal, wearing clothing, hunched over as if it were unable to stand straight, bright red, porcine facial features, and carrying a club that looked quite a bit more refined and dangerous than a stick. Then she realized what she was doing and forgot utterly about the beast. Ah! She turned the slate in her hands, watching as the perspective displayed on it shifted with its orientation. Fascinating. It seems this device has more uses than I had given it credit for. She crouched down, setting it on her knees, watching as the image of the ground shifted from blurriness to clarity in less than a second. A self-correcting focus. It can detect distance, then? What else can you do, I wonder? She turned it over in her hands again, taking note that there were various buttons on the face and top of the slate. She pressed on these experimentally, which caused the slate screen to shift through several displays that she didn't understand. Mostly they seemed to be empty, with a small notation that read in Hylian, "The shaky slate has been damaged." Damaged, REU. And now I have a name. She flipped through several more screens, wondering at the functionality that was missing from it. If it could display images obtained through some sort of lens, the question of what else it could do set a fire in her brain. She could be holding an artifact of untold sophistication, but be utterly unable to meaningfully interact with it. In a fit of pique she kept flipping back and forth across the device's screens, wondering at them but never sticking for too long. Then one gave her pause. The screen was mostly blank, with blue grid lines to indicate the scale of something that wasn't entirely clear to her. A small yellow dot inside of a large dot flashed in one section of the grid, while a yellow triangle pointed at nothing in particular. Plainly this is meant to indicate something, but what? Is it related to the device's other functions? Its viewing mode? She raised it up, as if to look through its lens at the beast in the distance, but the screen did not change. For no reason she could name, she swept it to the side, as if taking in a panorama, and as she did so the triangle began to rotate. She had to keep herself from shouting in surprise and delight to have it respond to her. She jumped to her feet, forgetting the sense of dread and danger that had so badly oppressed her before, and swung the slate around. The triangle on the display matched her degree of rotation perfectly. I see. So if the triangle indicates the orientation of the Sheikah slate, or perhaps the person holding it, then that would mean that the blinking circle... She shifted her position, holding the slate up in front of her, looking between the horizon and its screen as she turned. Now, assuming reasonable scale of distance, and by that she meant assuming that it wasn't indicating an object that was not on the plateau, if I orient myself properly, I find... The triangle, which she now thought of as an arrow, swung into perfect alignment with the circle. She looked into the distance and saw a pile of rubble. I hope it's not as simple as that. Swapping back to the viewing functionality, she zoomed in on the spot, then could not fight the grin that muscled its way onto her face. Perfect. What seemed to be a pile of rubble was in fact a series of large stone sheets partially obscuring an artificial structure beneath them. With her naked eyes she couldn't tell clearly, but through the slate she saw that the structure was apparently made of the same stone as the chamber she had woken up in, and therefore linked to the Sheikah slate. It even has the proper color of lights. She closed the viewer on the slate and returned it to her hip. Well then, if my journey started with the slate, it only makes sense that it should guide me further. Thoughts of the temple were totally forgotten, and the presence of the red beasts only floated at the edge of her awareness, troubling her only very little. The potential of discovering some great secret, solving some ancient puzzle which no one else had, made her steps light as she walked down the path and along the ridge toward the wide plain where her destination waited. There were more of the monsters than she had previously assumed, but after seeing that they rarely looked up from their own routine she became much less afraid. She stayed low when near them, still, and was as quiet as she could make herself, but the old man had been right, they simply weren't very observant. Two seated at the bottom of a ravine seemed to be speaking in a language she couldn't comprehend, and she thought idly that if she were strong enough to shift one of the boulders atop the ravine then they probably wouldn't even see it coming. When she came down to the flatter part of the plateau where the ruins were located, she stopped at the head of a wide and ruined staircase to observe the route she intended to take. On the right, the south, was an open path that led near to an enormous skull, easily the size of a building, and she wondered what kind of beast could have a head that large but did not think on it for too long because the monsters had apparently set up a watch around it. They have sentries and guards, and can build towers. What sort of society and culture do they have, I wonder? Clothing, weapons. Swinging the slate back toward her destination, she noted two of the beasts standing atop a knoll off to the northeast. Their lines of sight there would be quite long, and they have. Are those bows? She clicked her tongue, wishing for the ability to zoom in closer on the slate. Hard to say, but if they are then they are handmade. Still, it would be best to avoid them if possible. She looked toward the ruin itself, sucking air through her teeth. Oh. In front of the entrance to the ruins, before what appeared to be the only opening in the rubble, was another one of the beasts. This one was clearly guarding the entrance, and compared to its fellows it was more dangerously armed. In its left hand it carried a crude shield, and in its right it held not a club but a sword. Stolen, maybe? Everything else they carry appears to be handmade. But that doesn't matter, stolen or not. The fact that it carries the sword suggests that it knows how to use it, and it may be the martial superior to its fellows. She closed the view on her slate, put it back on her hip, thought for a moment. Based on its posture, sneaking in behind it would be too risky. These things never seem to focus on one subject for very long, so it may turn and discover me before I've discovered whatever is special about those ruins. The words of the old man, that any of these things was a match for a well-armed traveler, stuck in her mind. Perhaps it would be easier to seek out the temple, then. But no, there had been another of them there, too. Less well-armed, but much more mobile, much more eager in its patrolling. If she was ever going to see any part of this plateau, some degree of confrontation seemed inevitable. Putting it that way made her stomach lurch, and for one wild moment she thought she was going to be sick. She breathed, and it passed, and she started her walk down the half-buried steps. She swung north, darting between fallen pillars and ruined walls, keeping a careful watch for any watchful eyes. On her left she saw a pond, and beyond that what looked like an encampment for the beasts, but they were too far to see her unless they were looking. She made her way across the field in that fashion, swinging around to approach the rubble from the northern side, so the stones lay between her and the sentry. She was too far away to be spotted by the bow beasts, but she crept carefully anyway, mindful that if she was wrong then she would also quickly be dead. She pressed herself against the stone of the rubble as she rounded it, not feeling its warmth, too mindful of her own movements and trying to make sure she did not betray herself with noise. At last she came to a stone that she judged to be in the right spot, and peered around it with all the slowness in the world. There, facing away from her, the red beast with its sword and shield. It swung its head back and forth, sniffing at the air, and she wondered again if it might smell her, if she was upwind of it, if she could outrun the thing, burdened as she was with the axe. They were, everywhere, all over the plateau, and if an open chase started then getting completely away from them would be impossible. They would surround her, and bring her down, and she grabbed hold of that thought and strangled it, tossing it onto the rubbish heap at the back of her mind. Let her amnesia take that, and she would have no more like it. There, she told herself but did not dare to say out loud, had no place in what she was doing. She didn't know what that was, precisely, but she did know that one did not simply wake up in the middle of mysterious rooms and have precious artifacts left for you without some sort of purpose. Purposes, by their very nature, needed to be fulfilled, so fulfill it she would, no matter what that meant. The beast yawned. Zelda loosened the strap holding the axe to her back, and took it in both of her hands. It was heavy, very heavy, but she had tested it earlier and knew it to be freshly sharpened, too. The beast scratched itself, and she crouched low. Quick and quiet, she told herself. Quick and quiet, quick and quiet, quick and quiet. But mostly quiet, quiet first, she told herself as her feet moved, bringing her closer and closer. She shifted her hold on the axe, praying till she knew not what gods that the sweat on her hands would not be enough to ruin her grip, that the bow-carrying sentries would not wander in this direction, that the creature would not turn to face her. She raised the axe as she came within 5 paces and she could feel it. She could feel it. Feeling her there. It was going to turn around. It was going to turn around now. The impact of the axe's head against the creature's spine sent a shock up her arms. It did not cry out. It dropped, limp, and moved no more. The axe was still buried in its back as it lay motionless, its sword and shield falling softly to the earth. She covered her mouth with her hands. She could not know this, but it was the first time she had ever killed anything herself. The person she was before had never even intentionally swatted at horseflies. The echo of this fact rebounded inside of her, over and over, having no perspective with which to anchor itself and tell her why her head was filled with a scream the creature had not voiced. She crouched low, tried to stop herself from shaking. This is relief, she said to herself, and on some level this was true. While Zelda tried to control this upwelling of a feeling she could not fully identify and did not understand, a creeping darkness poured out from within the wound on the creature's back, quickly suffusing the entire body so that no light cast any of its features into relief. It was like looking at an emptiness left in space. Then it burst, silently, into smoke and purple-colored vapors. 2 objects clattered to the ground, left behind in its passing. Zelda stared at this, and it was ultimately her curiosity that sank its hooks into her and pulled her along. It was hard, harder than it should have been, to creep toward the spot where the creature had fallen, to cross those few steps. But cross as she did, and her relief and terror and fear and shame was slowly pushed aside as she came closer to the spot. Firstly and lastly she was curious. Firstly and lastly she had to know. "Gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Gone as if it had never been here in the first place. How? Some kind of sorcery? Are these things composed of magic, though they behave according to the laws of flesh?" She reached to the two objects that had fallen in the creature's passing. Her hands were shaking, still, and she glared at them, willing them still so that she could examine more confidently. Once she was satisfied that she would drop nothing, damage nothing, she picked up the two objects, one in each hand, and turned them in front of her face. A tooth, and a horn. Clean, as if they were bleached, as if they were not anchored in a living thing only moments ago. So, perhaps they were not. Perhaps these things are not genuinely alive in the first place. But, too many questions. She put the tooth and horn in a pouch on her belt, cinched it shut. She picked up her axe, strapped it to her back again, started to turn and leave. "No," she said. "No, the sword and the shield. You might have needed better tools to protect yourself." So she picked these up, and strapped them to her back too. Heavy, but not so heavy as she would have thought. Zelda stopped, still crouched, and breathed, trying to take inventory of her own thoughts. She was still upset, yes, but the nature of the creature had alleviated that somewhat. Maybe later she could stop and examine why so much of that shock had been replaced by relief, but on some level she guessed that she had already started thinking of the crimson beasts as being evil rather than properly living. That was unfair, and she would need to examine it for later, but right now, in this moment, she needed that surety to keep walking. She took it. She rubbed her face with her hands, wishing desperately for a handkerchief, and turned back to the ruin. Now, at last, she would be able to find something. She walked quietly, because it had become a quickly learned habit rather than out of necessity, but she need not have. When she stepped into the shadow of the ruins, she saw a pedestal much like the one that had been in the chamber where she had woken up. The orange light, the absence of both blue and the symbol of the eye, defense, sent a pleasant chill up and down her arms. "Place the shake slate in the pedestal." The voice that emanated from the pedestal was high and pleasant, its diction precise and clipped and strange. This should have shocked her. She was quickly discovering that very little could, now. "Is that what you want?" she said, leaning in, tilting her head back and forth. Indeed, there was a recess in the center of the pedestal roughly in the shape of the slate. She spent a few seconds thinking this over, wondering if she would be able to get the slate back, but ultimately deciding that trading ignorance for knowledge was quite the bargain. "So be it. But I expect you will return it." The voice gave no answer. "Very well." She took the slate from her hip and placed it, oriented vertically, in the standing slot meant to receive it. As soon as she did, the entire device tilted back until it was flush with the surface of the pedestal, and then it rotated with a pleasant click so that the blue eye on the back of the slate stood out against the orange light surrounding it. The raised center of the pedestal sunk in further until it too was flush with its base, and as it began to rotate she recognized that she was watching the reverse of the motions that had given her the slate in the first place. The machine settled into place, and the orange lights glowed brighter. "Shake tower activated." The same crisp, strange pronunciation. "What is a shake tower?" Ignoring her, the voice continued, "Please watch for falling rocks." She looked up out of instinct. The rocks here seemed quite settled. As she was looking, she saw that the pedestal was sitting beneath an arch-like structure constructed of similar stone, and on that structure the eye symbol began to glow. Then the earth shook, and it occurred to her that falling rocks could be a problem. Then the earth heaved beneath her and her weakened legs gave out and she fell backward and her head slammed into the stone. On the great plateau the bokoblins looked up in confusion and terror as the earth heaved, and when the Sheikah tower rose into the sky it sent a hail of stone in every direction. This was a signal. It was a signal to the other towers all over Hyrule, each of which rose from the earth in answer to their long-awaited summons. It was a signal to a village in the mountains of Necluda, where an old woman looked out from beneath her wide-brimmed hat and felt new life breathed into a hope that had very nearly died. It was a signal to that village sister community, where men and women in red uniforms donned masks of rotated eyes, knowing that their time was at hand. It was a signal to the world that something was shifting, that the perilous stalemate of a century was coming to an end. It was a signal to the beast within the castle, which screamed in fury and defiance as the world moved to stifle it. It pushed against the very seams of creation, and the earth and sky both groaned with the effort of containing its fury. So long it had been held, and now that time is coming to an end, one way or another. She knew none of this. She was dreaming again, and knew it as soon as the dream began. There was no preamble now, no gentle shifting from darkness to light. The woman was before her in all radiance, and she knew that she was looking upon a goddess. The woman's eyes were soft, warm, gentle, sorrowful beyond imagining. There was an enormity of experience there, an enormity of burden and of pain, which echoed inside of Zelda as surely as if she had experienced it herself. "You have," the goddess said, "and will again." "I do not know where I am," Zelda said, and the many ways in which that were true hung in that space, and the goddess nodded in her perfect understanding. "We are of one heart. Know this, a terrible evil threatens Hyrule, and it grows more terrible by the day. You have slept for 100 years, my Zelda, and in that time the world has stood on the edge of utter annihilation. You must stop it. You must save the world, and everyone in it." But, and that word was everything, but she had to add more to it. "But I can't do that. I don't know who I am. Well, I do know what I am. I'm weak, and frightened, and I have hands that have never done real work." The goddess's eyes blazed, sunset in a sea of gold, but she did not look away from them. This intensity was not ire, it was compassion. "I know. But even so, you will do it. There is no one else who can, and time, your time, our time, grows perilously short." Hands as large as the world reached out for Zelda, embraced her, enfolded her on a scale she didn't understand, pulled her against the goddess's shoulder. In that embrace, the goddess was no larger than Zelda herself. "Your burden is the heaviest of all burdens. Save only one, but I know you can carry it. I know you will carry it." She realized she was weeping, some unremembered familiarity lancing through the part of her mind that was still sleeping, and she did not know why she wanted to stay here, only that she did. "I am so afraid." "Fear is only one of the many obstacles before you, daughter, but it is both the greatest and the one that will never leave you. It will be your companion and your nemesis. It will guide you and mislead you, by turn. I cannot take it from you, and for that I am sorry." "Oh. How am I supposed to do this?" The warmth, the familiarity, was overwhelming. She knew this light, this voice, this embrace, this feeling of belonging and being. Hands as vast as the world gently moved her away, and her perspective shifted again, and once more she was looking at a woman whose light could fill the cosmos. "You will know what you have to do, but you must remember." The light grew greater, and the darkness with it, and Zelda panicked as she realized she was waking up. "Remember," the goddess said. "Try to remember." She awoke, and the goddess was gone. Zelda still had her words, though the timbre of her voice was fading, the warmth of being held by her. She tried to hold on to those memories, but they were slipping, as dreams do. She wished she could write them down, didn't know how much it would do. Behind her the pedestal pronounced that it was gathering information from the surrounding environment. She knew, remotely, that it was gathering up knowledge in a liquid state and transferring it to her slate, that the slate functionality was either being expanded or restored, but in that moment she had no thought to spare for it. The words of the goddess echoed in her mind, and she looked north to her castle. Even from this distance she could tell it was beautiful and that it was wrong. The castle itself, the surrounding city, even the countryside was couched in a whirling miasma as thick as smoke and much more persistent. Black and purple dominated the light in that space, much like the beast that she had felled. As she looked, the darkness built up. The miasma whipped into a frenzy, and in the distance she heard a roar. Then, above the roar, above the darkness, there was a light. As she watched, the miasma whirled and thinned, and the gathered darkness dissipated. Light exploded from the castle's keep. Cleansing. The light was cleansing. Blue light that stilled the earth with a song that rang out in an ancient voice. The earth shook once more, and there was another roaring bellow, but that voice drowned it out. She was crying again. She did not know why, but knew that she would find out. Zelda wiped her eyes, turned back to the chic slate, retrieved it. It now displayed a topographical map for the entire plateau, and informed her that more towers would expand its available data. She would need to remember to visit them, but for now she put the slate back on her hip. The tower's rise had put her very high in the air, and momentarily she thought that perhaps she was trapped there, but a golden light bearing a golden voice was still clear in her mind. She found the one opening in the floor, judged that she would break her legs if she tried to jump to a low platform, and began the slow climb down to it instead. Slowly, methodically did she descend, each time judging the distance to the next platform down, each time climbing as carefully as she was able, each time stopping to rest only briefly. The tower was more of a pillar of stone shot through with glowing veins of blue ore, surrounded by a sort of stone mesh that provided good hand and footholds, but the climb itself was still long and difficult. About halfway down she ate an apple, decided she would need to gather more, and cook them, at that. It was nearly 3 hours before she reached the ground. She was congratulating herself when she heard a call, and turned, and saw the old man sailing down on some device she didn't recognize. It would be good to have. She stepped forward to meet him. My, it would seem we have quite the enigma here. Something in her face must have given him pause, whatever he was prepared to say dropping away from him. What is it? I need to reach the castle to the north, she said, because it was true. I think I will need your glider to do it. You have been very generous to me, and I'm sorry that I must depend on your generosity again, but I would have it. His expression was carefully controlled, but for some reason she found him familiar, could read the subtleties of his face where others might not have been able to, fractions of expressions that told her that he was reconsidering her, weighing her. That familiarity it shut her, but she said nothing. Instead it was he who continued, Would you be willing to work for it? She felt the weight of the axe on her back, thought of the weight of the sword and shield as she picked them up, how they would feel in her hands. The words of the goddess were still with her, though she could not remember the face, and the sense of belonging was fuzzy and indistinct. But more than either of those, more than both put together, she thought of an ancient voice singing a single note that would forfend annihilation, and a radiant blue light that stood at the threshold of the dark, beating back the doom of the world. This last most of all, she knew mattered. Tell me what I have to do. End of chapter.